The Nuremberg Trials are remembered as the moment the Third Reich finally faced justice. 8 judges, 4 nations, a courtroom that invented modern international law. But one of those 8 judges had personally signed off on more political executions than several of the Nazis sitting in the dock in front of him. And after the verdicts, he flew home to a promotion. Before we get to the men in those chairs, the structure of what they were sitting in matters. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg ran from November 1945 to October 1946. 335 days of testimony, evidence, and argument. 4 nations supplied the bench: the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France. Each sent 1 primary judge and 1 alternate. 8 men in total, deciding the fate of 22 of the most senior surviving figures of the Third Reich. The verdicts came down in early October 1946. 12 death sentences, 7 prison terms ranging from 10 years to life, and 3 acquittals. Hjalmar Schacht, Franz von Papen, and Hans Fritzsche walked free over furious Soviet objection. That is the version of Nuremberg most people know. The version that doesn't survive the official record begins with the man whose hand actually wrote the famous judgment, and who never got to vote on it. Norman Burkitt was the British alternate. By the formal rules of the tribunal, alternates did not vote on the verdicts. They sat through every session, took notes, deliberated alongside the primaries, and went home without their names on the final ballot. And yet, according to John Parker, the American alternate, a man with no reason to flatter a colleague, Burkitt drafted a large and most important part of the trial's judgment. The wording everyone now associates with Nuremberg, the framing that shaped how we still talk about crimes against humanity, came largely from a man whose vote did not technically count. It was a strange English kind of arrangement. The British president of the tribunal, Geoffrey Lawrence, took the public credit. Burkitt did the legal work behind the curtain, frustrated and uncredited, writing private letters about how the procedural setup had reduced him to a glorified clerk. After the trial, the rewards came, but slowly and at a distance from what he had actually done. He joined the Court of Appeal in 1950. He retired in 1956. He was made Baron Burkitt of Ulverston and died in February 1962, an English judge among English judges, the courtroom workhorse of the most famous trial of the 20th century. If you find these stories worth your time, the kind of history that doesn't survive the official version, go ahead and subscribe. The man with the actual top job got something Burkitt never did, and his retirement plan is where the strangeness of the Nuremberg bench really begins. Geoffrey Lawrence was the president of the tribunal, the man in the centre seat, the face of the verdicts, the voice that read the sentences. The London Observer described him as a robust, stocky man, immediately wary of any excess in word or action. That cautious presence was exactly what the British government wanted in the chair. In January 1947, 3 months after the last gavel, he was elevated to the peerage as Baron Oaksey and made a Lord of Appeal in ordinary. The reward was direct, fast, and explicit. The British establishment closed ranks around its man and pinned a title on him before the ink on the trial transcript was dry. He retired from public life in 1957. From then until his death in 1971 at the age of 90, the man who had presided over the conviction of Hermann Göring and Joachim von Ribbentrop spent his time in Oxfordshire breeding Guernsey cattle. The shift was not metaphorical. It was a working farm, with herds and feed schedules and ribbons at country shows. He attended the local agricultural fairs. He judged livestock at competitions the way he had once judged the men who built the Third Reich. The president of the International Military Tribunal became a gentleman farmer, and the British public, which had filled cinemas to watch newsreel footage of the Nuremberg verdicts only a decade earlier, let him do it without comment. Not every Western judge got that kind of soft landing. Across the Atlantic, the American story was less about reward and more about damage control. Francis Biddle was the American primary judge. He was also a problem. Biddle had served as Roosevelt's Attorney General, and when Truman took the presidency after Roosevelt's death in 1945, he wanted Biddle out. Truman fired him, politely, with the necessary handshakes, but firmly. The new president needed his own people, and Biddle was Roosevelt's. The trouble was that you could not just push a former Attorney General into the political wilderness. Truman needed a graceful exit for him, somewhere that looked like a promotion rather than a dismissal. Nuremberg was the answer. It was prestigious, it was overseas, and it was time-limited. Biddle accepted, and Truman quietly resolved a domestic political problem by sending it to Bavaria. The American alternate, John J. Parker, was a different kind of placement. In 1930, Parker had been nominated to the Supreme Court and rejected by the Senate after a bruising fight over his record on labor and civil rights. The wound never fully healed. Truman had no intention of nominating him to the court again, but he also did not want Parker simmering at home as a symbol of past democratic failures. Nuremberg moved him too, so 2 of America's 4 seats on the most important bench in modern legal history were filled for reasons that had almost nothing to do with the crimes the trial was meant to address. Both men landed comfortably on the other side. Biddle chaired Americans for Democratic Action from 1950 to 1953 and remained a fixture in liberal Washington until his death in 1968. Parker served on the United Nations International Law Commission in 1954 and continued his federal judgeship until his death in 1958. Their post-war lives were quiet, comfortable, and largely uncontroversial. The careers of men who had been useful in the right place at the right time. The strangest personal arc on the bench, though, belonged to the Frenchman. In 1935, Henri Dondieu de Vabre travelled to Berlin. He was a professor of criminal law at the University of Paris, a quiet academic with a snow-white walrus moustache that he twirled for emphasis when he spoke in public. He had been invited to debate a question that nobody in 1935 expected to matter very much. Could an international criminal court ever exist? And if so, what would it look like? His host on the German side was a lawyer named Hans Frank. Frank was Hitler's personal attorney, the future president of the German Academy of Law, and at that point, one of the most prominent legal voices of the new regime. The 2 men disagreed politely in the academic register of the time and went home. 11 years later, Dondieu de Vabre watched Hans Frank walk into a Nuremberg courtroom, not as a debate opponent this time, as the convicted Governor-General of occupied Poland. The man who had administered the general government from Krakow, signed off on the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, and overseen a territory in which the deaths ran into the millions. The same lawyer the Frenchman had once politely disagreed with about whether international criminal law could exist, now stood in the dock as living proof of why it had to. The Frenchman helped sentence him to hang, and Dondieu de Vabre did not stop there. On May 13, 1947, 7 months after the verdicts, He formally proposed a permanent international criminal court to the United Nations General Assembly. He worked alongside Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish lawyer who coined the word genocide, on what would become the 1948 Genocide Convention. He spent the last years of his life building the legal architecture that the 1935 debate had only been able to imagine. He died in Paris in 1952. By then, the framework he had pushed for at the UN was already slowly turning into international law. But while the French judge was building, the Soviet judge had already broken every rule that framework would later be designed to enforce. In August 1936, 9 years before he sat at Nuremberg, Iona Nikitchenko presided over the trial of the 16, the first of Stalin's Moscow show trials. 16 old Bolsheviks stood in front of him, including Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev, men who had built the Soviet Union alongside Lenin himself. The defendants had been broken in advance through interrogation and threats against their families. They confessed on cue. The verdicts were decided before the trial began. All 16 were sentenced to death. All 16 were shot within 24 hours in the cellars of the Lubyanka before any appeal could be heard. That single trial, one bench, one presiding judge, produced more death sentences than the International Military Tribunal would impose after 335 days of proceedings. The IMT handed down 12. The trial of the 16 handed down 16. And the 1936 trial was not the end of Nikitchenko's record. He remained on the Soviet Supreme Court's military collegium through the 1937 trial of the 17 and the 1938 trial of the 21, which together produced dozens more political executions, including the show trials of Bukharin and Rykov. He brought that record with him to Nuremberg, before the IMT had even convened, during the pre-trial London conference where the Allied powers were still arguing over the rules of the trial. Nikitchenko reportedly told his Western counterparts that if the judge was supposed to be impartial, it would only lead to unnecessary delays. The remark was preserved in the conference records. None of his colleagues seems to have known what to do with it. His judicial career had begun during the Russian Civil War in 1920, and it rose entirely through Soviet political trial work. He had none of the academic legal pedigree that Dondieu de Vabre or Burkett or Parker carried. He had been useful to Stalin during the worst of the purges, and he had been useful to Stalin in being sent to Nuremberg. For 10 months, he sat in judgment of crimes against humanity while having spent the previous decade conducting the closest civilian analogue to those crimes himself. He voted to convict. He voted on the death sentences. He objected formally to the 3 acquittals. And after the verdicts, he flew home to Moscow, returned to his seat on the Soviet Supreme Court, and continued his career without interruption. He died in Moscow on April 22, 1967. There was no internal Soviet review made public. There was no Western press obituary of any size. Most of his Western counterparts had already received titles, peerages, and high judicial appointments by the time of their deaths. Nikitchenko received none of those because the Soviet system did not work that way. But he did not need them. He had survived. The man whose presence on the bench was the single greatest moral problem of the trial was simply absorbed back into the system that had sent him, and outlived almost every Western judge who had sat beside him. The deepest criticisms of Nuremberg, when they came, did not come from German nationalists or Soviet apologists. They came from inside the American legal establishment itself. Harlan Fiske Stone was the sitting Chief Justice of the United States during the trial. In private correspondence, He called the proceedings a high-grade lynching party, and, elsewhere, a little too sanctimonious a fraud to meet his old-fashioned ideas of justice. Coming from the head of the American judiciary, the language was extraordinary, and it was kept private for good reason. 2 years later, Charles Wennerstrom gave Stone's private complaint a public voice. Wennerstrom was not a judge of the IMT. He was a judge of the subsequent Nuremberg Tribunals. The American-led follow-on trials run at Nuremberg from 1946 to 1949, legally distinct from the International Tribunal, though the two are still routinely confused. In February 1948, after presiding over one of those trials, Wennerstrom resigned and gave an interview to the Chicago Tribune. The prosecution, he said, had failed to maintain objectivity, aloof from vindictiveness. The interview was reported in the New York Times on February the 25th, 1948, under a headline noting that the judge stood firm in his war trial case. The framing here matters, and it deserves to be said clearly. Neither Stone nor Wennerstrom disputed that the Nazi crimes were real. Neither disputed that the defendants had committed them. The crimes were documented to a standard that has never been seriously challenged in any reputable scholarship since. What Stone and Wennerstrom questioned was procedural impartiality, particularly given who was sitting on the other side of the Soviet bench. That is a narrower criticism than it is sometimes made out to be. It is also a much harder one to dismiss. Whatever the courtroom's flaws, the legacy that 8 judges left behind turned out to be larger than the controversy. The men in those chairs created the legal architecture of every war crimes trial that followed. Donnedieu de Vabre's May 1947 proposal at the UN launched 50 years of effort that culminated in the 1998 Rome Statute and the International Criminal Court at The Hague. The Genocide Convention came into force in 1951. The ad hoc tribunals for the former Yugoslavia in 1993 and for Rwanda in 1994, and every prosecution of a sitting head of state for crimes against humanity since 1945 trace their authority back to the bench at the Palace of Justice. Even the trial's harshest American critics never tried to dismantle what it created. But one piece of that bench's story was permanently buried. Alexander Volchkov was the Soviet alternate. What happened to him after Nuremberg is largely undocumented in Western scholarship. The Soviet archives never opened on him. Whatever internal review the USSR might have conducted on Nikitchenko's dual role, if any review ever happened at all, died with the system that kept it quiet. 8 men sat in those chairs, 6 were rewarded, 1 escaped consequences entirely, and the man whose hand actually wrote the famous judgment never cast a single vote. The official structure of Nuremberg and the actual structure of Nuremberg were 2 different courts. Thanks for watching History Hangover. If you found this video insightful, check out our other deep dives into the trials, figures, and aftermath of the Second World War. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next upload.